Let's begin by looking at a mock-up of our to-do list application. And it's a mock-up of the UI, specifically the main UI that would come up the second we start up our application or the second we get to it in our web browser. It's a simple to-do item list. We've got our to-do items right here, and then we've got a component we've got a place for creating them. And then we have something for listing them. And then we have something for displaying a independent to-do item. Now, one thing before we jump into components and their UIs and creating the JSX that builds the HTML and then talk about rendering, let's first talk about how we decide what our components are and how we might break them up in order to decide what components we actually need to create inside of our application for our user interface. And usually what I do is I like to mock up what I would like the application to look like. And then based on that mock-up, I will begin to identify what is what. Like I begin to separate concerns and look at functionality. And based on concerns and functionality, I will begin to break up the application into what I think are going to be the individual React components. And of course, I'm equating a React component to functionality or to separation of concerns. So let's break down this UI based on functionality and separation of concerns and try to figure out what our components should be. Now, we kind of already have an introduction to this in that we already created a to-do item display. And so if we look at our mockup right here, let's go through the process of identifying what our components are going to be. Now, by the fact that we created a to-do item display, we've kind of already identified one of the components, and that is going to be the to-do item display that is used inside of a list of to-do items. So our to-do item display is really this right here. It's responsible for rendering a single to-do item in sort of this condensed format for a list. Now, if we have a list of to-do items, that implies that we need a component that manages the list of to-do items. So this right here would most likely end up being its own component. And then down here we can see that we have functionality that we're providing, which is the ability to create a new to-do item with the name and description, just like we did when we created our dummy data. So this data model here of a name and a description makes a to-do item. So this most likely is going to end up being its own React component, specifically for creating a new to-do item. So if we go ahead and look at this and we identify right here that we have a create display item component, a list to do items, and then a to do item display. And of course, this is a create to do item. So those are going to be our individual components that we're going to start out with as we build our application. Now we already have our to do item, and then we're going to need another component for listing the to do items. And then we will create a component for creating a new to-do item. And we're going to do it in that order. And we'll start out with the one we already have, which is our to-do item display. And we're going to create the JSX that will end up being the HTML that we see displayed when the list component actually runs through and lists all of our to-do items. So let's jump to building the UI for our to-do item display. Here's that original component that we created, the to-do item display, and we should still have it running here. And we see it right here. And if we inspect it, we can see that right now it is a single to-do item display component rendered at the root of our app. And we're going to leave it like that for now because we don't have our list of to-do items component yet created. So let's work on just the to-do item. So we know, based on the dummy data we created, that a to-do item has a name and a description. Now, in our list, depending upon what we want, and looking at this mock-up we have of the UI, we can leave it at just the name, as being displayed here, or we could choose to add the description just below it or tacked onto it. It all depends on what you want to see in your to-do item. Now, just so we can show things later on, we might want to have it so that when we click on a to-do item, a little window pops up and it shows us more details about the to-do item. So we'll keep it simple right now with a to-do item simply displaying the name portion of our to-do item data model. So in here, what we're going to do is get rid of our default text there, and we're going to leave it as simply a div for this. And of course, this returns our JSX, which then gets transpiled into HTML and gets injected into our app where we use this to-do item display. Now, just to test out this display, and because we don't have our list created, our list component created yet, we're going to use some dummy data inside of our to-do item just so that we can get everything working. So I'm going to go ahead and put a note right here. Note, dummy data needs to be removed after to-do list component has been created. And let's create ourselves just a block or a dummy to-do item. Because remember, this to-do item display handles a single to-do item. So I'm going to borrow this one right here for now. I'm going to go ahead and do let equal to-do, or sorry, let to-do equal. And then we've got ourselves our dummy object right here that we can test stuff out on. Now inside of JSX, we can actually inject any JavaScript that we have into our HTML simply by using the curly braces right here. And in those curly braces, we simply call the data that we want to show. Here, we're going to use our to-do item, and then we're going to do .name. And that is going to be the whole of our to-do list item. So if we come back, we let it compile, we go back to our page, we can see to-do item 1 actually shows up. So we are dynamically adding content to our JSX from a JavaScript object, and we're injecting that right into the JSX that was built for our to-do item display, and which is being returned when that to-do item is called here inside of this parent component right now, being the app component. So that really takes care of this particular UI that we have set up or mocked up for our application. And if we look at this right here, we can see that it is pretty dang close to what we want. We do still need to create our list component in order to list all of those to-do items. Now coming back to our code, we've kind of hit this several times that the return of our functional component will actually return the JSX that we have written. Inside of our to-do item, we've got our div with the class of to-do item display, and then we have our to-do.name in here. Now, of course, we're not going to hard code our data in this component going forward. We're actually going to have this data passed to our component from the parent component. Right now, the parent component is our app component, but as we looked in our display here, and as we outlined everything right here, we know that we have a list to-dos component or to-do list component that will be using the to-do item display inside of itself. And that's where we're going to go next in our application design. But before we do that, let's go ahead and, now that we understand our return method, let's go back here to our JSX. Let's kind of go over this in a little bit more detail. We've kind of glazed over it. The React DOM library that we pull in from React-DOM, this library has the ability to render React components. And this render function on the React DOM, what it does is it takes in a reference to an HTML element that actually exists inside of our page. So if we go ahead and inspect this, we know that inside of our body, there is a div that has ID root. And so we're looking for we're actually doing document.getElementById, which is good old JavaScript for locating an element that has a very specific ID inside of our HTML. When this function gets called and it asks for that root, what actually gets returned in place of this is going to be a reference to this HTML element inside of our browser DOM. And then it takes as its first parameter a React component. And it is that React component that will be injected as a child element of this element that gets returned right here by the document.getElementById. And that's why we're seeing our app component right here being injected into the root div that came inside of our HTML. And then, of course, inside of our app.js, we are importing another React component right here, the to-do item display. And then we are using it inside of the JSX of our app component. And we begin to see that parent-child relationship happening in our application already.